Brooklyn, New York, August 17th, 1981. A little past 9 at night, a 51-year-old man finishes a meal he already knows is his last. He doesn't rush it. Then he does something strange. He doesn't call a lawyer. He doesn't run. He walks into his own social club, finds his favorite bartender, and starts taking off his jewelry, piece by piece, and handing it over, then his apartment keys. Then one final instruction: feed my pigeons. Don't forget about them. A man doesn't give away his house keys before a business meeting. He gives them away before a funeral. His own. His name is Dominic Napolitano. Everyone who matters calls him Sonny Black. And in a few minutes, he's going to get in a car, ride to a quiet house in Brooklyn, and walk down a basement staircase. He will not walk back up. Here's what almost nobody around in that night fully understands. Sonny Black isn't being killed for stealing, for talking, for breaking any rule he ever swore to uphold. He's being killed because for 6 straight years, he trusted the wrong man completely. Slept in the same room as him, mentored him, called him a friend, never knowing that man was a federal agent, wearing a wire, building the case that would end his life. He's walking toward those stairs right now, and what he says on his knees in the dark, in about 90 minutes after the gun aimed at his head jams on the first pull of the trigger, is one of the coldest sentences ever attributed to a dying man in the history of the American Mafia. But to understand how he got here, we have to go back. All the way back to a working-class stretch of Brooklyn, in the middle of the Great Depression. Before we go there, quick pause. Comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching this from, and what time it is for you right now. It's always strange to think this story is landing on screens in a dozen different time zones at once, all at the same moment. While you're down there, hit like, subscribe, and tap the notification bell, so you don't miss what's coming, because this is a true story of a mob captain who spent 6 years unknowingly training his own executioner, and it only gets heavier from here. Now, back to Brooklyn. Dominic Napolitano was born on June 16, 1930, in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, a working-class enclave of tenements, docks, and factory smoke wedged along the East River, staring across the water at the Manhattan skyline, like a poor relative who was never invited inside. His family soon settled into neighboring Williamsburg, the neighborhood that would define every chapter of his life. The place he was raised, the place he would raise his own children, the place where he would build an empire out of a modest storefront social club, and the place, ultimately, where the machinery of his death would quietly begin turning. His grandparents had come from Naples. This detail matters more than it might seem at first, because in the internal caste system of the American Mafia, Sicilian bloodlines carried a kind of mystique, a deeper, older claim to the traditions of Cosa Nostra, the our thing that traced its roots to the hills and villages of western Sicily. Napolitano's family, by contrast, was Neapolitan. He was not born into the innermost aristocracy of the underworld. He would eventually help run. Everything he achieved by climbing, not by inheriting. In an organization that prized bloodline and pedigree as much as it prized muscle and nerve, Dominic Napolitano started a half step behind and spent his entire life closing the gap through sheer force of discipline. Brooklyn in the 1930s and 1940s was its own kind of country. Italian immigrant families were packed into railroad apartments above butcher shops and social clubs. The air thick with the smell of espresso, sawdust, and cigarette smoke drifting out of storefronts where old men played card behind fog windows. It was a world stitched together by parish churches, ethnic loyalty, and an unofficial but very real economy that ran parallel to and often beneath the legitimate one. For a certain kind of young man growing up in that world, the path into organized crime wasn't some dramatic fork in the road. It was closer to gravity. The neighborhood produced longshoremen, laborers, small shopkeepers, and, quietly, a steady supply of young men who drifted into gambling, small-time hustling, low-level theft, and the loosely organized rackets that Italian-American crime families ran out of candy stores and cab stands. Napolitano's introduction to that world came early and unremarkably, the way it did for thousands of boys of his generation. There was no single cinematic moment where a Brooklyn teenager decided to become a gangster. There was a slow accumulation of small choices, running numbers for the older men on the block, learning which doors you didn't ask questions about, understanding early that certain men in the neighborhood commanded a different kind of respect than the police, the priests, or the shop owners. Petty crime, street gambling, The apprenticeship of the underworld, which in Brooklyn's Italian enclaves in the mid-20th century didn't require an application. Just proximity, patience, and the right temperament. And Napolitano's temperament, even as a young man, was already distinctive. Multiple accounts from people who knew him, and later from Pistone himself, describe him not as a hothead or showboat, but as something rarer in that world. Quiet, observant, disciplined. He was not the loudest man in the room. He was the one watching the room. In an environment where flash and bravado often got young men killed before they turned 30, Napolitano's instinct toward restraint was itself a survival skill, one that would define the entire arc of his career, right up until the moment restraint could no longer save him. There is one detail about him that shows up again and again in every retelling of his life, a detail so specific and so human that it has outlived almost every other fact about him. His hair. Dominic Napolitano was born with blonde hair. As he aged into his 30s and 40s, that hair didn't darken the way most people's does. It turned instead to a startling gunmetal, almost silvery white, prematurely aged, striking against his olive Neapolitan skin. Vain, or simply pragmatic about how a man in a position needed to look. He began dyeing it black, jet black, severe, unmistakable. And that single cosmetic choice is the entire reason history remembers him as Sonny Black, rather than by whatever nickname a blonde-haired Brooklyn kid might otherwise have picked up on the street corners of Greenpoint. It's a strange thing to consider that one of the most consequential figures in the story of American law enforcement's war against the Mafia is remembered by a nickname born out of a bottle of drugstore hair dye. But that is exactly the kind of granular, almost absurdly human detail that made Sonny Black feel real to the people who knew him, and it's the kind of detail Joseph Pistone would later use to bring him to life on the page, not as a cardboard mob villain, but as a specific, three-dimensional man with vanities and habits and a face you could actually picture. The Mafia that Sonny Black was raised to enter in the 1940s and early 1950s was not the Mafia of tabloid headlines and Hollywood shorthand. It was, in its own internal logic, closer to a medieval guild system, a world where rank was not simply given. It was earned across years, sometimes decades, through demonstrated loyalty, discretion, and the willingness to absorb risk on behalf of men above you without complaint or hesitation. This was not a fast-track meritocracy. A young man did not walk in off the street and get made formally inducted as a full member of a crime family within a year or two of showing promise. The old world code, imported largely from Sicily and southern Italy and adapted to the streets of New York, demanded patience most modern institutions would find almost incomprehensible. You proved yourself. You kept your mouth shut. You did the unglamorous work. Collections, muscle, small-time larceny. Favors nobody would ever thank you publicly for years before anyone above you even considered vouching for your induction. This slow burn apprenticeship shaped Napolitano's entire worldview, and it's essential to understanding both his rise and his eventual downfall. He did not believe in shortcuts. He did not trust men who moved too fast, made too much noise, or tried to buy respect instead of earning it. Later in his life, when he was mentoring young associates, including, fatefully, a jewel thief named Donnie Brasco, Napolitano's own philosophy about power in that world would surface again and again in blunt, almost weary phrases. Every day, he'd tell the men under him, is a struggle. There's always somebody looking to take what you have. You don't get to relax. You don't get to assume loyalty just because a man smiles at you and calls you friend. Power in that life, in Sonny Black's understanding of it, was never a fixed possession. It was a constant, exhausting negotiation, defended daily against men who would just as easily replace you as follow you, the moment weakness showed. It is almost unbearably ironic in retrospect that the one blind spot in that worldview, the one relationship where Napolitano's guarded, hard-won philosophy of never fully trusting anyone simply didn't apply, would be the relationship that destroyed him. But that story is still years away. First, Napolitano had to climb his path up through the ranks of the Bonanno crime family, one of New York's Story 5 families, alongside the Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, and Colombo organizations, ran primarily through his relationship with a Bonanno captain named Michael Sabella. Sabella became Napolitano's mentor, the older, established capo who took the younger man under his wing and effectively sponsored his development inside the organization. This mentor-protege dynamic was a standard architecture of advancement inside Cosa Nostra. A young soldier attached himself to an established captain, learned the family's specific rhythms and rackets under that captain's crew, proved his value through earning capacity and discretion, and, if he was good enough and patient enough, eventually inherited authority either alongside or in place of the man who trained him. By the early 1970s, accounts place his rise to prominence around 1973. Napolitano had established himself as a soldier of real substance within Sabella's crew, operating primarily out of the Williamsburg section of Brooklyn where he'd been born and raised. This was not incidental. Napolitano's power base, unlike some mafia figures who operated across scattered territories, was intensely local and intensely personal. Williamsburg was his neighborhood in every sense. The streets he'd grown up on, the people he'd known his whole life, the community that had watched him become exactly the kind of man his environment had shaped him to be. That hyper-local rootedness gave him something valuable in the underworld. Genuine community standing, not just fear-based authority. People in that neighborhood didn't just fear Sonny Black. Many of them, by every account, actually liked him. And this brings us to one of the more counterintuitive truths about Dominic Napolitano, one that separates him from the cartoonish, all-menace archetype that pop culture often assigns to mob captains. He was, by nearly every surviving account, including Pistone's own later writing, a genuinely magnetic, well-liked figure within his world. He wasn't a screamer. He wasn't flashy or ostentatious with his money the way some of his contemporaries were. He carried his own suitcases when he traveled, a small but telling detail that speaks to a man who didn't feel the need to perform status through servility from others. He was, according to those who knew him, not a 24-hour gangster, meaning you could sit across from him and have an actual conversation about something other than mob business, that he had interests and a personality that existed outside the narrow performance of underworld toughness. He kept prize racing pigeons on the rooftop above his club, animals with pedigree bloodlines reportedly descended from championship birds bred in France, Germany, and Russia, and he won real money racing them. A strange, almost tender hobby for a man whose day job involved extortion, loan sharking, and violence. He was also, by multiple accounts, genuinely skilled with small firearms, an unglamorous but telling detail about a man who took the mechanics of his profession seriously rather than performing toughness for an audience. In public, he was described as polite, understated, never brazen. This was not an act, or at least not entirely one. It was consistent enough across enough independent testimony, including from an FBI agent who spent years studying him at close range, that it appears to have simply been who he was. A dangerous man, unquestionably, capable of ordering and participating in real violence when the organization demanded it, but also a man capable of warmth, of loyalty, of the kind of easy charisma that made people, even people who should have known better, want to be near him. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is the single most important truth for understanding everything that follows in this story. The tragedy of Sonny Black Napolitano is not the tragedy of a stupid man or a careless one. It is the tragedy of a man whose most genuine, most human qualities, his loyalty, his capacity for real friendship, his instinct to mentor and protect the people he brought into his orbit, were the exact qualities that a patient, brilliant undercover operation was engineered to exploit. As Napolitano rose to the late 1960s and into the 1970s, he built a reputation inside Bonanno circles as exactly the kind of captain every boss claims to want and rarely actually gets. Tough when toughness was required, disciplined in his business dealings, unwaveringly loyal to the men beneath him, and possessed of what more than one account describes as a genuinely watchful, observant eye, more disciplined and more careful, in fact, than his own mentor Sabella had been. His crew operated out a modest, unassuming storefront social club at 420 Graham Avenue in Williamsburg, a two-story wood-frame building on the corner of Graham Avenue and Wither Street that would become, over the following decade, one of the most consequential addresses in the entire history of American law enforcement's war against the Mafia. The club was called the Motion Lounge. We'll return to that building. Its address will matter enormously to the story, as will the pigeons that lived on its roof. But for now, understand it simply as the physical center of gravity for Napolitano's growing operation. It was here that Sonny Black ran a crew involved in an extensive menu of illegal enterprises: burglary, hijacking, loan sharking, bookmaking, illegal casino operations, extortion, and eventually drug trafficking. His crew was, by the accounts of those who studied it, including federal investigators who would later spend years documenting its every transaction, one of the most consistently profitable operations inside the entire Bonanno family. Above the club, Napolitano kept an apartment. On the roof, his pigeon coops. Two friendships forged during this period of Napolitano's rise would prove decisive to everything that followed, one in the direction of loyalty and eventual leadership, one in the direction of catastrophe. The first was his close, genuine friendship with a fellow rising Bonanno figure named Joseph Massino, a relationship that would endure through the 1970s, survive an internal war within the family, and eventually place Massino at the very top of the Bonanno hierarchy as its boss. The bond between Napolitano and Massino was not simply professional convenience. Multiple accounts describe it as one of real, sustained personal closeness, the kind of friendship built across years of shared risk. It's worth flagging early, because this friendship, as close as it was, would ultimately not be strong enough to save Napolitano's life when the organization's own logic turned against him. We will come back to that irony later. The second consequential relationship of this era was with Philip Rusty Rostelli, the Bonanno family's official boss, though boss is a complicated word to apply to Rostelli for most of this period, because for large stretches of the 1970s and beyond, Rostelli ran his family from behind prison walls. Rostelli had known Napolitano before his incarceration, and even from inside federal custody, he relied on trusted street-level lieutenants to execute his will and protect his interests. Napolitano, alongside Massino, became one of those crucial conduits, the men who kept Rostelli's authority alive and enforced on the outside while the actual boss sat in a cell, unable to personally manage the day-to-day power struggles unfolding without him. This arrangement, a boss governing in absentia through a small circle of trusted captains, is a critical piece of context for understanding the chaos that was about to consume the Bonanno family, chaos that would ultimately hand Napolitano both his greatest promotion and, years later, the very insecurity that would make him vulnerable to the machinery of his own death. Because in the summer of 1979, everything changed. On July 12th of that year, Carmine Galani, the ruthless, ambitious acting power inside the Bonanno organization during Rostelli's imprisonment, a man notorious for his greed, his brutality, and his open contempt for the other New York family's authority, was gunned down while eating lunch on the patio of Joe and Mary's Italian-American restaurant in Bushwick, Brooklyn. Galani had just lit one of the cigars that gave him his nickname, Lilo, or the cigar, when masked gunmen opened fire, killing him along with the restaurant's owner and one of Galani's own Bonanno allies. Investigators and later Mafia insiders would come to believe that Galani's murder was not an internal Bonanno matter alone, but something closer to a sanctioned execution, a hit that the leadership of the other New York crime families had effectively blessed, because Galani's aggressive, unilateral push to dominate the lucrative heroin trade was seen as a destabilizing threat to everyone's interests, not just the Bonanno families. Whatever the precise machinery behind Galani's death, its consequences inside the Bonanno organization were immediate and seismic. With the ambitious, dominant Galani removed from the board, a reshuffling of power followed almost instantly. Several of Galani's close allies and loyalists, men who had benefited from his ascendance, were abruptly demoted, stripped of rank and standing. Among them was Michael Sabella, Napolitano's longtime mentor, the man who had brought him up through the ranks over the better part of a decade. And in Sabella's place, replacing his own mentor, Dominic Sonny Black Napolitano was promoted to Capo Regime, a full captain, commanding his own crew, answering directly to the family's leadership, no longer a soldier climbing but a made man of real institutional authority. He was 49 years old. It had taken him roughly 3 decades of patient, disciplined, unglamorous work to arrive at that rank, precisely the kind of slow, earned ascent of the old world code he'd been raised inside demanded, and precisely the opposite of how his life's greatest betrayal would ultimately be engineered. He inherited Sabella's crew, absorbed its operations into his own growing enterprise centered at the Motion Lounge, and, alongside his close friend Joseph Massino, became one of the 2 essential street-level lieutenants, keeping the imprisoned Philip Rostelli's authority intact against a family that was, in the wake of Galani's murder, anything but unified. Because Galanti's death did not settle the Bonanno family. It cracked it open. A rift developed between two competing visions of the family's future. One faction remaining loyal to the imprisoned Rastelli, managed on the street primarily through Massino and Napolitano, and an opposing faction increasingly assertive, aligned around a trio of ambitious capos who believed Rastelli's continued leadership from behind bars was an unsustainable arrangement that left the family vulnerable and rudderless. That opposing faction was led, most prominently, by a capo named Alphonse Sonny Red Indelicato. This rivalry between the Rastelli-Massino-Napolitano faction and the Indelicato-led dissident faction would simmer for nearly 2 years before it exploded into one of the most infamous multiple murders in modern Mafia history, an event that would come to be known as the Three Capos Murder. It is central to this story, and we will walk through in full detail shortly, because Sonny Black Napolitano's direct participation in that bloodshed, and the loose end it left dangling, is the exact hinge point that connects his rise to his downfall. But before that war fully erupted, something else was happening in Napolitano's world. Something quieter, slower, and ultimately far more consequential to his personal fate than any single act of violence. A stranger was about to walk into his life. And Sonny Black, the disciplined, watchful, hard-to-fool captain who had spent 30 years learning exactly how to read men, was about to make the one misjudgment in his life that no amount of street wisdom could have protected him from. Because the man walking toward him wasn't playing by the rules of the world Sonny Black had spent his whole life mastering. He was playing by the rules of an entirely different institution, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. To understand how thoroughly Sonny Black would be deceived, you first have to understand how carefully, how patiently, how almost obsessively that deception was built. This wasn't a rush sting operation or an informant thrown together in a matter of weeks. It was, when it finally concluded, the longest sustained undercover infiltration of the American Mafia in the history of federal law enforcement up to that point. And it began, quietly and almost accidentally, with a completely different case. Joseph D. Pistone was born on September 17, 1939, in Erie, Pennsylvania, and raised largely in Paterson, New Jersey, a background that mattered more than it might initially seem, because Paterson's own working-class Italian-American communities gave Pistone something invaluable for the role he would eventually play, a genuine lived fluency in the rhythms, cadences, and unspoken codes of Italian-American street culture. He wasn't an actor learning lines phonetically. He had grown up around men who talked and moved and thought the way the wise guys he'd later infiltrate talked and moved and thought. Combined with his fluency in Italian and Sicilian and his own Sicilian heritage, Pistone was, on paper, almost uncannily well suited for a role nobody had yet asked him to play. He joined the FBI in 1969, beginning what would become a 17-year career with the Bureau. By the mid-1970s, the FBI in New York City was grappling with a persistent, costly problem. Organized truck hijacking rings, operated with a tacit protection and involvement of mafia-connected fences, were siphoning enormous quantities of stolen cargo, trucks, goods, merchandise, into the underworld economy, and traditional investigative methods weren't cracking the networks moving that material. In the spring of 1976, Pistone volunteered for an undercover assignment intended, originally, to run for roughly 6 months. Infiltrate the hijacking and fencing networks tied to organized crime, identify where stolen goods were being moved, and build cases against the people running the operation. For that assignment, the FBI constructed a false identity. Donnie Brasco, a low-level jewel thief with connections to the criminal underworld. A backstory chosen deliberately, because jewel theft and fencing gave Pistone a natural, plausible reason to be moving in and out of criminal circles without raising immediate suspicion. And crucially, the FBI didn't simply hand Pistone a cover story and send him out with nothing behind it. He underwent extensive preparation, including actual gemology instruction, so that when he sat across from real criminals and talked about diamonds, cuts, clarity, and street value for stolen jewelry, he wasn't affirming knowledge he didn't have. He actually possessed it. This is a detail worth lingering on, because it captures something essential about why this operation succeeded where so many others would have failed. The specificity of the deception. Donnie Brasco wasn't a vague sketch of a criminal. He was built with a kind of granular, checkable detail that could survive real scrutiny from suspicious, streetwise men whose survival depended on their ability to spot a fraud. Pistone's own name, meanwhile, was effectively erased from FBI records associated with the operation, a precaution against the very real danger that Mafia associates with law enforcement contact of their own might run a name and blow the entire operation and Pistone's life in an instant. The operation began in earnest in September 1976, and what was supposed to be a 6-month assignment targeting hijackers and fences would, through a combination of Pistone's skill, the Bureau's patience, and a series of relationships that deepened far beyond anyone's original expectations, stretch on for nearly 6 years. It did not happen quickly. There was no dramatic shortcut into the inner circles of organized crime. For roughly the first year, Pistone did the slow, unglamorous groundwork of undercover work, haunting the bars, social clubs, and back rooms where mob-connected men gathered, letting himself be seen, letting his cover story circulate organically rather than pushing on anyone, building the kind of quiet, patient presence that eventually gets low-level criminals talking. He wore a wire during many of these early encounters, recording conversations that would eventually become evidence, and, because taking visible notes in that world would have been an instant giveaway, he committed an enormous amount of information to memory instead. Names, faces, license plates, relationships, debts, grudges, the entire informal social architecture of a criminal subculture held entirely in his head and transcribed only later, in private, away from any eyes that mattered. His entry point into the Bonanno family specifically came through a mobster named Anthony Mira, who first brought Brasco into contact with the organization's orbit. But it was Mira's introduction of Pistone to a Bonanno soldier named Benjamin Lefty Guns Ruggiero that truly opened the door. Ruggiero was, by any measure, a dangerous man to get close to, a career mobster reputed to have been involved in the deaths of over 24 people across his decade in the life, street smart, suspicious by professional necessity, the kind of man whose approval could not be won through flattery or bluff. Ruggiero tested Brasco relentlessly in these early encounters, peppering with questions designed to probe for exactly the kind of inconsistency that would expose a phony. Questions about the code, about criminal procedure, about the specific texture of a life Brasco was claiming to have actually lived. Pistone passed those tests, not through luck, but through the same discipline that defined the entire operation, staying, in his own later articulated philosophy of undercover work, as close to the truth and as close to his own real personality and values as possible, adjusting demeanor and instinct gradually rather than performing an entirely foreign persona that would eventually crack under pressure. Ruggiero, seeing genuine potential, and, just as importantly, seeing an opportunity to impress his own superiors by bringing a promising new earner into the fold, took Brasco under his wing. By 1976, Pistone had won the trust of Ruggiero fully enough that, on Ruggiero's own recommendation, Donnie Brasco was accepted as an associate working with Ruggiero's crew. What followed was 6 years of a relationship that was, in its own perverse way, devastatingly real. Pistone and Ruggiero didn't simply transact business together in a cold, arm's-length fashion. They ran actual criminal operations together, burglarizing jewelry stores, handling stolen merchandise, moving through the day-to-day texture of mob life shoulder to shoulder. Pistone sat across tables from men who had ordered killings, who carried weapons as a matter of routine, who possessed both the capacity and the willingness to end anyone deemed a genuine threat. And through it all, he had to perform not just trustworthiness, but ordinary human familiarity. The small talk, the shared meals, the late nights, the accumulated intimacy of years spent in close daily proximity to the same small circle of men. It was through the same period, and through his gradually deepening standing inside Ruggiero's Bonanno orbit, that Pistone's path eventually crossed with Dominic Sonny Black Napolitano, first as Sabella's crew and then, after Napolitano's 1979 promotion, following Galani's murder, as a newly minted captain running his own operation out of the Motion Lounge. The transition of Pistone's primary loyalty and daily proximity from Ruggiero toward Napolitano did not happen instantly or without friction. Accounts describe something close to a quiet internal competition between the two men over Brasco's allegiance, with Napolitano ultimately emerging as the figure who most directly took the young jewel thief under his personal wing, integrating him into the day-to-day operations and social rhythms of the Motion Lounge crew. And it is here, inside Sonny Black's orbit specifically, that the relationship at the emotional center of this entire story truly began to take shape. It would be easy, in retelling this story, to reduce what happened between Sonny Black Napolitano and the man he knew as Donnie Brasco to a simple case of professional deception, an undercover agent doing his job, a criminal getting fooled. But that framing misses what actually made this operation so historically significant, and it misses what makes Sonny Black's eventual fate so genuinely tragic rather than simply ironic. The bond that formed between these two men, across years of shared proximity, was not fake in the way a con artist's smile is fake. It was constructed strategically, deliberately, in service of federal investigation. But the day-to-day texture of it, the actual lived experience of friendship, was startlingly real on at least one side, and arguably, in its own complicated way, on both. Pistone would later write about this directly, with a candor that adds enormous weight to everything that follows. He described Napolitano not as a caricature of underworld menace, but as a man he came to genuinely respect. Someone who wasn't a phony, who didn't throw his weight around gratuitously, who carried himself, in Pistone's own later assessment, as a stand-up guy by the internal logic of the world he inhabited. Pistone would go so far as to write that, for reasons difficult to fully articulate even in retrospect, he simply liked Sonny Black a great deal. This mutual, if deeply asymmetric, human connection developed through countless small, specific moments rather than any single dramatic scene. Brasco became enough of a fixture in Napolitano's world that he would sometimes sleep on Sonny Black's couch after long nights, waking up in the same apartment above the motion lounge, sharing the ordinary, unglamorous domestic rhythm of a morning, including in one detail that has survived across multiple retellings precisely because of how disarmingly human and mundane it is, watching cartoons together before the day's business began. There is something almost unbearably poignant in that image once you know how the story ends. Two men on a couch on a quiet Brooklyn morning, half watching a children's cartoon, one of them a career Mafia captain who has ordered violence and absorbed violence in equal measure across 3 decades in that life, the other a federal agent silently gathering intelligence that would, within a few years, help dismantle the very world that Captain had spent his entire adulthood building. And yet, in that specific moment, simply two men sharing a quiet, unremarkable morning together. Pistone would also spend time with Napolitano up on the roof of the motion lounge, among the pigeon coops, watching Sonny Black lean against a railing and look out over the rooftops of the Williamsburg neighborhood, where he'd lived his entire life. The same streets he'd been born into, grown up in, built his criminal career across, and would eventually be killed for failing to protect from infiltration. Pistone later wrote about wondering, in those quiet rooftop moments, what exactly Sonny Black was thinking about as he looked out over that skyline. It's a small, strange detail to have survived so vividly across the retelling of this story, but it captures something essential about the emotional register of the entire operation. This was never simply cops and robbers theater. It was 6 years of real human proximity, real shared time, real accumulated trust, built on the federal side, in service of an eventual betrayal that both men, on some level, may have understood was always the operation's ultimate destination. Napolitano, for his part, began actively mentoring Brasco in the practical philosophy of survival and advancement inside the Mafia, teaching him, in blunt and repetitive lessons that Pistone would later recall almost verbatim, that everything in that world reduced to strength, to power, to how ruthless a man was willing to be, because that ruthlessness was the actual currency of advancement, far more than money or even loyalty alone. Sonny Black wasn't performing wisdom for an audience. He was genuinely trying to prepare a younger associate he had come to see real potential in, potentially believed was worth investing his own personal reputation and standing to cultivate for survival and eventual advancement inside an organization where a single miscalculation could cost you your life. The bitter irony writes itself, but it's worth stating plainly anyway. Every lesson Sonny Black taught Donnie Brasco about how to survive and rise inside the Mafia was, simultaneously, evidence being gathered against the very organization those lessons were meant to protect. Every act of genuine mentorship was, from the other side of the relationship, also an act of intelligence collection. And Napolitano, a man whose entire life philosophy was built around never fully trusting anyone, never assuming loyalty without ongoing proof, a man who had told his own crew, over and over, that someone was always looking to take what you had, extended precisely the kind of unguarded, personal trust to Donnie Brasco that he preached against extending to anyone. Why? This is a question worth sitting with, because it's the emotional center of everything that follows. It wasn't naivety. Napolitano was not a naive man. 3 decades of survival in a genuinely lethal profession does not happen by accident or luck. Part of the answer lies in exactly how good the Bureau's construction of Donnie Brasco actually was: specific, checkable, lived in, built to survive real scrutiny from suspicious men. Part of it lies in the sheer duration of the deception. Trust built gradually, across years of shared risk and shared time, doesn't feel like trust extended to a stranger. It feels like trust earned by someone who has already proven himself, again and again, in 100 small ways, across half a decade. And part of it, the part that makes this story genuinely tragic rather than simply a cautionary tale about carelessness, is that Sonny Black Napolitano appears to have simply humanly liked the man he knew as Donnie Brasco, liked his company, valued the specific texture of friendship that, whatever else it was, gave a hard, guarded man a rare space to be something other than perpetually on guard. That is the friendship the story is built around. It is a friendship that would eventually make Napolitano vulnerable to a level of trust he extended to almost no one else in his life. Trust significant enough that, as we'll see, he began actively working to have Donnie Brasco formally inducted as a made member of the Bonanno family itself, the highest institutional honor the Mafia could confer. And it is a friendship whose eventual, inevitable unraveling would leave Napolitano not just professionally compromised, but genuinely, personally devastated, in ways that would echo all the way to his final days. But before we reach that unraveling, we need to walk through the years of life Napolitano and Brasco actually built together inside the Bonanno family. The rackets, the road trips, the Florida ventures, and the internal power struggle that was quietly building toward one of the bloodiest nights in the modern history of New York organized crime. Because it was in the middle of that internal war, a war Sonny Black himself would help wage with his own hands, that he would make the request that changed everything, asking his trusted friend and associate Donnie Brasco to help eliminate a threat to the family. He was, without knowing it, handing a murder contract directly to a federal agent. By the time Dominic Napolitano was promoted to captain in the summer of 1979, the man he knew as Donnie Brasco was no longer a peripheral associate hanging around the edges of his crew. He was becoming something closer to an unofficial partner, trusted enough to be brought into business ventures that extended well beyond the familiar streets of Williamsburg, all the way down to the sun-bleached edges of Florida's Gulf Coast, into territory controlled by an entirely different criminal organization altogether. In 1979, Napolitano, together with Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero and Brasco himself, moved to establish a nightclub roughly 20 miles north of Tampa, in a small community called Holiday, Florida. The venture would come to be known as the King's Court Bottle Club, sometimes recorded in period accounts simply as Knight's Court, and it represented something significant in Napolitano's ongoing evaluation of Brasco's value to him. This wasn't a low-level street hustle. It was an attempt to build a legitimate-looking business front that could double as a hub for illegal gambling operations, and it required something the Bonanno crew from Brooklyn did not automatically possess: the blessing of Sando Trafficante Jr., the reigning boss of Florida's organized crime landscape. Tampa and the broader Florida underworld operated under trafficking authority in a way that made Miami, by contrast, something closer to an open city, but venture into trafficking's actual territory without his approval, and you were inviting a war nobody in Brooklyn wanted any part of. It fell largely to Brasco, under Napolitano's direction and with his explicit approval, to help broker that alliance, traveling to Florida repeatedly over roughly the final 2 years of the operation to help negotiate the terms under which the Bonanno crew's Florida gambling interests could coexist with trafficking authority. This is worth pausing on, because it illustrates just how deeply embedded and how genuinely trusted Brasco had become inside Napolitano's operation by this point. A capo does not send a peripheral hanger-on to negotiate directly on a behalf with the boss of another family's entire territory. He sends someone whose judgment he trusts and whose discretion he's confident in. Sonny Black was, by 1979 and 1980, extending exactly that level of trust to a man who was, unbeknownst to him, quietly documenting every detail of the arrangement for federal prosecutors. Trafficking's approval was eventually secured, in part because the arrangement promised a lucrative revenue stream, without requiring trafficking's own people to handle the day-to-day operational risk. But the venture's fate illustrates something equally important about the constant, grinding instability of the world Napolitano operated in, a world where alliances were provisional, favors were currency, and even a well-negotiated business arrangement could collapse overnight because of an entirely unrelated rivalry playing out hundreds of miles away in Brooklyn. The rivalry in question was the one steadily hardening between Napolitano's Rastelli loyalist faction and the opposing faction led by Capo Alphonse, Sonny Red, Indelicato. And it was that rivalry, according to multiple accounts of the period, that eventually reached down into Florida and strangled the King's Court venture. In January 1981, on the night of the planned event tied to club's operations, local police raided the club, seizing cash and making arrests, Napolitano himself among those charged, along with an undercover agent working the Florida side of the operation. Napolitano, furious, reportedly threatened violence against the undercover officer involved before eventually cooling down, and it took direct intervention from the FBI itself, working quietly behind the scenes to have the resulting legal proceedings against Napolitano shut down, a necessary but almost surreally delicate maneuver, since the federal government needed Sonny Black free, functional, and unsuspecting for the far larger operation still unfolding around him. The raid, according to accounts of the period, is understood to have been arranged by corrupt police connected to the trafficking organization, done as a favor to Sonny Red and Delicato, a signal that the rivalry consuming the Bonanno family back in Brooklyn had real, tangible reach even into Napolitano's carefully cultivated Florida arrangement. It's a small but telling episode, because it demonstrates something essential about the environment Sonny Black was operating in during these final years before his death. Nowhere was truly safe from the internal Bonanno power struggle. Not Brooklyn, not Florida, not a nightclub 2 decades removed from the neighborhood where the rivalry had first taken root. The war between the Rastelli-Massino-Napolitano faction and the Indelicato-led dissidents was metastasizing, and it was only a matter of time before it stopped playing out through raids and business sabotage and turned decisively to bloodshed. To understand why that war existed at all, you have to return to the fundamental instability created by Philip Rastelli's imprisonment. A crime family, at its core, functions through a chain of command, a boss whose authority is unquestioned, whose decisions settle disputes before they escalate into violence, whose presence alone deters the kind of internal ambition that destabilizes an organization from within. Rastelli, sitting behind bars for most of this period, could not provide that presence. He could issue instructions through trusted intermediaries, chiefly Massino and Napolitano, but an imprisoned boss governing by proxy is, almost by definition, a boss whose authority is more vulnerable to challenge than a boss who can enforce his will directly in person with immediate consequences for defiance. Sonny Red and Delicato, along with fellow capos Phil Lucky Giacone and Dominic Big Trinchera, came to represent exactly that kind of challenge. All three had themselves been promoted to captain in the same reshuffling that had elevated Napolitano following Carmine Galani's 1979 murder, meaning that Napolitano, Indelicato, Giacone, and Trinchera were, in a sense, peers, all having risen to the same post-Galani vacuum of power, all commanding their own crews, all holding roughly equivalent institutional rank. But where Napolitano and Massino remained committed to Rastelli's continued authority even from behind bars, Indelicato and his allies grew increasingly convinced that Rastelli's imprisonment made him an unsustainable, even dangerous, choice to continue leading the family. Account of the period describe Indelicato's faction as increasingly assertive, at times openly disrespectful toward the arrangements Massino and Napolitano were trying to hold together on Rastelli's behalf, and more ominously, according to testimony that would surface years later from cooperating witnesses, actively planning to move against Massino and Napolitano themselves, potentially through violence, to clear the way for a leadership change the dissident faction believed was both necessary and inevitable. This is the environment Sonny Black Napolitano was operating in throughout 1979, 1980, and into 1981. A Bonanno family functionally split into 2 hostile camps, both technically still part of the same organization, both still observing the outward courtesies of Mafia protocol, while privately maneuvering toward a confrontation that both sides understood, on some level, could only end in bloodshed. Napolitano, according to later testimony from his close friend Joseph Massino, was directly involved in monitoring the growing threat, reportedly informing Massino that Indelicato's faction, through associates connected to Indelicato and his allies, had repeatedly signaled hostile intentions toward the Rastelli loyalist leadership. By the spring of 1981, Rastelli, through his trusted lieutenants, made a decision, according to testimony that would later surface in federal court, most notably from Massino himself, once he became a cooperating witness decades afterward. Massino sought guidance from leaders of other New York crime families as the internal Bonanno crisis approached its breaking point, consulting with figures including Colombo boss Carmine Persico and Gambino boss Paul Castellano. Their counsel, according to that testimony, was blunt and immediate. Act now, before Indelicato's faction acts first. What followed was one of the most infamous coordinated assassinations in the modern history of the American Mafia, an event that would come to be known across decades of retelling as the Three Capos Murder. On May 5, 1981, a meeting was arranged at a Brooklyn social club, the 2020 club in the Clinton Hill section of the borough, under the pretext of finally resolving the tension between the two Bonanno factions. A peace conference, ostensibly, to smooth over the growing hostility before it consumed the family entirely. Giacone and Delicato and Trinchera were invited to attend. As was standard practice of this kind of sensitive internal meeting, all three men arrived unarmed, a long-standing rule for peace sit-downs, meant to signal good faith and prevent exactly the kind of ambush that was, in fact, being prepared for them. Accompanying them as backup was an associate named Frank Lino. The meeting was a trap from its inception. Inside a storeroom at the club, Napolitano's allies, including Massino himself, along with Bonanno associate Orlando Sciascia, Salvatore Vitali, and additional gunmen, lay in wait, some concealed inside a closet, ready to spring the moment the three capos and their escort entered. Among the gunmen brought in for the operation were two associates from Montreal, including a Canadian mobster named Vito Rizzuto, brought south specifically to participate in the ambush, a detail that speaks to how carefully, how far in advance, and across how wide a network this operation had been planned. When Giacone, Trinchera, Indelicato, and Lino were led into the storeroom under the pretense of the peace meeting, a prearranged signal, Sciascia running his hand through his hair, triggered the ambush. Gunmen burst from the closet where they'd been hiding. Giacone attempted to flee and was shot down. Trinchera, a physically massive man weighing well over 300 pounds, absorbed multiple rounds of gunfire and refused to go down easily, ultimately requiring a shotgun blast to finally end the struggle. Indelicato made a run for the same door Lino had managed to slip through, but where Lino escaped, remarkably passing undetected by Bonanno lookouts posted outside, Indelicato did not. He was held by the leg as he tried to flee, and was ultimately shot in the head at close range. Three capos, murdered within minutes of each other, inside a Brooklyn nightclub, under the pretense of a peace conference meant to end their rivalry rather than settle it permanently. Their bodies were subsequently transported to a desolate lot in Lindenwood, Queens, a patch of ground long used as an informal burial ground by organized crime figures, known within the underworld simply as the Hole. The lot itself belonged, in terms of underworld territorial control, to the Gambino crime family, and it was Gambino Capo John Gotti who personally arranged for his own people to bury the three bodies there, a professional courtesy extended to Massino, one family doing another a quiet, practical favor in the aftermath of an internal execution, evidence of just how interconnected and mutually accommodating the five families could be, even while each maintained its own separate chain of command and its own separate internal politics. Dominic Napolitano's role in this operation was not peripheral. He was, alongside Massino, one of the central architects and participants in orchestrating the elimination of the dissident faction, a decision and an act of violence that must be understood plainly and without euphemism, in keeping with the historical record. This was Sonny Black directly involved in planning and carrying out the murder of three fellow captains within his own crime family. Men he had risen through the ranks alongside in order to preserve the leadership structure he and Massino had committed themselves to protecting. It's worth pausing here to acknowledge something important about how this story is being told. It would be easy, given the genuine warmth and human complexity of Napolitano's relationship with Donnie Brasco, to soften or minimize the side of who he was. That would be dishonest. Sonny Black Napolitano was Simultaneously, and without contradiction in the internal logic of the world he inhabited, a man capable of real personal loyalty and warmth toward people he trusted, and a man capable of orchestrating the cold-blooded murder of 3 colleagues in order to protect institutional power. Both of these things were true of him. Neither cancels the other out. This duality, a man who could watch cartoons on a couch with a friend in the morning and help plan a triple murder in a nightclub store weeks later, is not a contradiction to be explained away. It is simply what life inside that world required, and Sonny Black had spent 3 decades becoming exactly the kind of man capable of holding both realities without apparent conflict. But the Three Capos Murder, for all its brutal efficiency, left one dangerous loose end, and it is this loose end that directly connects the internal Bonanno war to the FBI's undercover operation in a way that would ultimately prove decisive to everything that followed. Sonny Red Indelicato had a son, Anthony Bruno Indelicato. Bruno had reportedly been expected to be present at the May 5th meeting alongside his father and the other 2 capos, but for reasons that remain part of the murkier edges of the historical record, he was not there that night. He survived, and in the brutal calculus of Mafia power politics, a surviving son of a murder rival is not simply a grieving relative to be left alone out of some notion of mercy or restraint. He is, almost automatically, a potential source of future retaliation, a young man with every motive in the world to seek revenge against the men who killed his father, and therefore, from the perspective of Napolitano and Massino, a threat that needed to be neutralized before it could organize itself into anything. Dangerous. Sonny Black turned to a man he trusted implicitly to help handle that threat. His associate Donnie Brasco. According to account of the period, Napolitano moved to have Bruno Indelicato eliminated, and it was Brasco, the jewel thief he had mentored, trusted, brought into his innermost circle of confidence, who was asked to help carry out or facilitate that killing. This is, without exaggeration, one of the most extraordinary moments in the entire history of undercover law enforcement operations against organized crime. A mafia captain, believing he was handing a delicate, high-stakes assignment to one of his most trusted and capable associates, was in fact handing a live murder contract directly to a federal agent of the United States government. The reported target location for this contract, according to multiple accounts, was Miami, Florida, meaning the same Florida connections that had been cultivated through the King's Court Bottle Club venture, the same network Brasco had spent nearly 2 years helping to build on Napolitano's behalf, were now being repurposed toward an assassination. The FBI's handling of this specific crisis illuminates something crucial about how the entire 6-year operation had actually functioned behind the scenes, because this was not, remarkably, the first time Pistone had been placed in this exact position. As an increasingly trusted associate operating first under Ruggiero and then within Napolitano's orbit, Brasco had reportedly been directed to carry out multiple killings over the course of his years undercover, assignments that, had he been a genuine criminal associate rather than a federal agent, he would have simply been expected to complete as a demonstration of loyalty and capability. Each time, the FBI faced an almost impossible operational and ethical puzzle. How do you keep an undercover agent's cover intact, over years, inside an organization that periodically demands murder as proof of loyalty, without either blowing the entire operation or crossing an absolute, non-negotiable line that no law enforcement operation can ever cross? The solution the Bureau developed, refined across multiple such incidents throughout the operation, involved carefully staged deceptions, arranging for the intended target to be quietly taken into custody or otherwise removed from danger through means that appeared, from a mafia's perspective, consistent with the target simply having vanished or been eliminated, while keeping the actual details vague enough, and Brasco's own account of events convincing enough, that his crew accepted the outcome without demanding the kind of verification that would have exposed the deception. This required an extraordinary, sustained level of coordination between Pistone and his FBI handlers, split-second improvisation layered on top of careful advanced planning, over and over again, across years, with the constant knowledge that a single miscalculation, a single detail that didn't hold up under scrutiny from suspicious men who had collectively ordered or participated in dozens of real murders across their careers, could cost Pistone his life on the spot. The Bruno Indelicato contract, however, represented an escalation the Bureau ultimately could not stage its way around indefinitely, and it arrived at almost exactly the same moment as an entirely separate, equally dangerous development. one that would force the FBI's hand and bring the entire 6-year operation to its climax. Before we get into how this all came apart, quick moment. If you're finding this story as gripping as I think you are, hit that like button and subscribe, because there's a lot more ground to cover and you don't want to miss where this goes. By 1980 and into 1981, the operation that had begun as a modest 6-month assignment targeting truck hijackers had become something almost without precedent in the history of American law enforcement. An active federal agent embedded inside 2 of New York's 5 families, sustaining an undercover identity not for weeks or months, but for years on end, accumulating a volume of intelligence, recorded conversations, documented rackets, mapped hierarchies, cataloged relationships, that promised to be genuinely historic in scale once the operation finally concluded and prosecutions began. But that same duration was, by this point, also the operation's single greatest liability. Every additional month Pistone spent undercover increased the cumulative risk of exposure. Every new person he met, every new relationship he was drawn into, every new criminal enterprise he was asked to participate in expanded the number of ways a single inconsistency, a single overheard conversation, a single unlucky coincidence could unravel 6 years of painstaking work. And, far more importantly to everyone involved, could get Pistone killed. The pressure compounding on the operation by 1980 and 1981 wasn't limited to the internal Bonanno turmoil we just walked through, though that turmoil alone would have been more than enough to elevate the danger considerably. A family actively purging its own leadership through assassination is, by definition, an environment of heightened paranoia, where every relationship gets scrutinized more intensely, where trust becomes a scarcer and more carefully rationed commodity, where the kind of long, comfortable familiarity Brasco had built with Napolitano over the preceding years could no longer be assumed to insulate him from suspicion. Rival families were growing increasingly nervous about the scale and duration of Bonanno instability. And inside the FBI itself, senior officials were growing increasingly uneasy about just how long they had allowed one of their own agents to remain embedded at this level of danger, a duration that had already, by this point, shattered every precedent for how long an undercover operative could reasonably be expected to sustain an identity, this deep inside organized crime, without the accumulated risk becoming untenable. And then, in the midst of all of this, came a development that would ultimately force the Bureau's hand entirely. Sonny Black Napolitano moved to have his trusted associate formally inducted as a made member of the Bonanno crime family. It is difficult to overstate what an extraordinary gesture of trust this represented, both within the internal logic of the Mafia and retroactively, in terms of just how completely Napolitano had come to believe in the man he knew as Donnie Brasco. Formal induction, becoming a made man, a fully initiated member of Cosa Nostra, rather than merely an associate operating on periphery, was the single highest institutional honor the organization could confer. It was not handed out casually or quickly. It required a sponsor willing to stake his own reputation and personal credibility on the candidate's loyalty and capability, and it typically followed years of demonstrated value to the organization. By moving to sponsor Brasco's induction, Sonny Black was, in effect, publicly and formally declaring to Rastelli, to Massino, to the entire Bonanno hierarchy, that he considered this man family in every sense that mattered inside the world he inhabited. But induction into the Mafia in this era carried with it a brutal, non-negotiable requirement that placed the entire 6-year operation on a collision course with an absolute, uncrossable line. To be made, tradition required, in most understandings of the ritual across the 5 families during this period, that a candidate participate directly in a killing, a demonstration, final and irrevocable, that he possessed both the willingness and the capability to spill blood on the organization's behalf. This was the ritual's entire point. It was not a bureaucratic formality. It was designed specifically to be uncrossable by anyone who wasn't genuinely, fully committed to the life. For Joseph Pistone, an agent of the United States government operating under an assumed identity, this requirement represented an absolute and total impossibility. Not a difficult operational challenge to be cleverly staged around, as previous close calls had been, but a fundamental, categorical line that could never, under any circumstances, be crossed. No amount of careful FBI stagecraft could manufacture a real, verifiable murder. And Sonny Black's proposal to formally induct Brasco meant that the operation had now arrived, definitively, at its absolute limit. The single point beyond which continuing to operate the assignment was no longer merely dangerous, but genuinely, structurally impossible to sustain. Compounding the crisis further was the Bruno and Delicato contract discussed a moment ago, a live assignment demanding a real killing, arriving at almost exactly the same moment the induction proposal was moving forward. Between these two converging pressures, the FBI's senior leadership made the determination that had likely been inevitable for some time, whether anyone wanted to admit it or not. After nearly 6 years, the operation had reached the absolute outer edge of what could be sustained without either compromising the integrity of federal law enforcement by allowing an agent to participate in real violence, or losing Pistone entirely to an exposure the Bureau could no longer adequately manage or predict. The decision was made to pull him out. This was not, it's worth emphasizing, a decision made lightly or reactively. It represented the difficult conclusion of an internal calculation the Bureau had likely been quietly running in the background for months, if not longer, weighing the extraordinary intelligence value the operation continued to generate against the escalating, now nearly unmanageable risk to Pistone's life, and against the emerging reality that the operation's central premise, an undercover associate who could indefinitely avoid the ultimate demonstration of loyalty the Mafia demanded of its inner circle, had finally, after 6 years, run out of road. What followed was the beginning of the operation's endgame, a carefully managed extraction, followed by a deliberate, calculated decision about exactly how, when and whom the truth about Donnie Brasco's real identity would eventually be revealed. A decision that would set in motion the final, devastating sequence of events for Dominic Sonny Black Napolitano, a man who, in the summer of 1981, still had no idea that the friend he had spent 6 years mentoring, defending, and trusting more deeply than almost anyone else in his life was about to disappear from his world entirely, and that the manner of that disappearance would decide whether Sonny Black himself lived or died. In July 1981, Donnie Brasco simply stopped appearing. There was no dramatic farewell, no final conversation in which Pistone explained himself, no goodbye extended to men who had spent years believing him to be one of their own. That absence of closure was, in fact, the entire design of the extraction, a calculated, necessary cruelty built into the operation's endgame. An undercover agent this deeply embedded cannot simply announce his departure and walk away cleanly. He has to vanish, the way a man on the run vanishes, or the way a man who has quietly been killed vanishes, leaving behind only speculation and unanswered questions for people who knew him. For Lefty Ruggiero, for Sonny Black Napolitano, for the entire crew that had absorbed Brasco into its daily rhythms across 6 years, this vanishing act would have registered first as strange, then as concerning, and eventually, once the truth surfaced, as something closer to a small earthquake running to the foundation of everything they thought they understood about the man they trusted. The FBI's decision about how to handle the reveal of Pistone's true identity is one of the more strategically fascinating and, in its own cold way, humane aspects of the entire operation's conclusion. The Bureau did not simply pull Pistone out and disappear quietly, letting the Bonanno family piece together the truth on its own through rumors, suspicion, or eventual court proceedings. Instead, federal agents made the deliberate decision to approach members of the family directly and tell them, in plain and unambiguous terms, exactly who Donnie Brasco really was. This decision was not made out of any obligation toward transparency or fair play toward organized crime figures. It was made, according to the accounts of the agents involved, for a far more practical and protective reason, to shield men like Lefty Ruggiero, men who had genuinely, unwittingly vouched for and mentored an undercover federal agent without any deliberate wrongdoing on their part, from being blamed, tortured, or killed by their own organization for having somehow failed to detect the deception themselves, or worse, for being suspected of having secretly known and covered for an informant. Inside the Mafia's own brutal internal logic, ignorance was not automatically an acceptable excuse. If the Bonanno family were left to discover on their own, gradually, through mounting circumstantial suspicion, that one of their trusted associates had actually been an FBI agent all along, the resulting paranoia could easily spiral into exactly the kind of internal violence the FBI hoped, at least partially, to prevent misdirected retribution against the wrong people based on incomplete information and mounting panic. By delivering the truth directly and unambiguously, the Bureau removed at least some of that ambiguity, even if it could not remove the underlying, inescapable consequence that someone, within the family's own logic, would still have to answer for the breach. The scene that followed has been documented from multiple angles, through Pistone's own later account in his memoir, and through the direct courtroom testimony, decades afterward, of one of the agents who was actually present in late July 1981. Pistone's own book places a date at July 28th, while Special Agent Doug Finkel's later sworn testimony recalls it as July 30th, a small discrepancy that speaks to how even participants in the same historical event can retain slightly different memories of its exact timing. FBI Special Agents Doug Finkel, Jim Kinney, and Jerry Lohr walked into the Motion Lounge on Graham Avenue in Williamsburg, the same modest storefront that had served as the operational heart of Napolitano's world for years, the same building where Brasco had slept on Sonny Black's couch and watched cartoons with him on quiet mornings. They found Napolitano and pulled him aside, according to Finkel's own later courtroom testimony, delivered during the 2004 trial of Bonanno boss Joseph Massino. The exchange was almost unervingly direct. Finkel asked Napolitano whether he knew Donnie Brasco and an associate identified as Tony Rossi. Napolitano confirmed that he did. Finkel then told him plainly they were FBI agents. According to Finkel's testimony, he explained to Napolitano that he wanted to make sure of his safety, and that he was likely facing a serious problem with the Bonanno crime family as a result of the revelation. Finkel offered his business card, hoping, perhaps not entirely realistically, but genuinely, that Napolitano might eventually reach out and consider cooperating with federal authorities rather than facing whatever consequences awaited him inside his own organization. Napolitano, according to this account, declined without hesitation, telling Finkel something to the effect that Finkel knew better than anyone that he couldn't take that step, but that he knew how to reach him if circumstances changed. Finkel's own retrospective account of Napolitano's reaction in that moment is worth dwelling on, because it captures something genuinely remarkable about the man's composure under what must have been one of the most devastating pieces of news he would ever receive. According to Finkel, Napolitano didn't collapse, didn't protest, didn't display any of the visible shock or denial one might expect from a man just informed that a trusted friend of 6 years had, in fact, spent that entire time secretly working for the government that wanted to destroy everything he'd built. He simply absorbed it. Finkel would later recall that he had almost expected some kind of dramatic reaction, that Napolitano might, in Finkel's own words, jump up and down or otherwise visibly break under the weight of the revelation. But instead, Sonny Black took the news with the same flat, controlled composure he might have shown if Finkel had simply told him what day of the week it was. Pistone's own written account of the encounter, relayed to him secondhand since he was not present for it himself, describes a slightly different but complementary version of Napolitano's initial reaction. Federal agents show him a photograph of Pistone in the company of fellow agents, and Napolitano responding with controlled, almost theatrically composed denial in front of the other men present, that he didn't know the man in the photograph, but that if he ever met him, he'd certainly know he was looking at an FBI agent. Whether the specific line was performed for the benefit of other crew members who may have been nearby, or whether it represents a slightly different retelling of the same essential moment filtered through second-hand reporting, the core substance across both accounts is consistent and devastating in its own quiet way. Sonny Black Napolitano received, in the span of a few sentences delivered by federal agents standing inside his own social club, the collapse of a 6-year friendship and the effective death sentence that would follow from it, and he received it standing up, without visible collapse, the same disciplined composure that had defined his entire career, now being called upon to absorb the single worst piece of news of his life. Shortly after the agents left the Motion Lounge that day, an FBI surveillance team photographed Napolitano tending to his pigeons on the rooftop above the club. The same quiet, private ritual he had shared, in gentler days, with the very man who had just been revealed to him as a federal agent. It's a haunting image to consider. A man processing the destruction of his closest friendship and, quite possibly, the beginning of the end of his own life, retreating to the one activity that had always offered him something like peace, tending to birds on a rooftop overlooking the only neighborhood he had ever called home. To fully understand what happened next, why the revelation of Pistone's true identity became, almost immediately, Not simply a professional embarrassment for Napolitano, but a mortal threat to his life. You have to understand something essential about how the Mafia's internal logic actually worked, a logic that is, in its own brutal way, entirely coherent and consistent, even though it can feel almost incomprehensible from the outside. The organization's disciplinary system did not, and does not, meaningfully distinguish between intentional betrayal and unintentional failure when the outcome produces equivalent institutional damage. This is a crucial point, and it's worth stating as plainly as possible, because it is the entire mechanism by which a man who did nothing morally wrong by the standards of his own world, a man who was deceived, not disloyal, could nonetheless be marked for death by the very organization he had served faithfully for 3 decades. Inside Cosa Nostra's operating logic during this era, what mattered above almost everything else was consequence, not culpability. The Bonanno family had just suffered what may have been the single most catastrophic security breach in its modern history. A federal agent had spent nearly 6 years embedded at the highest levels of one of its most productive crews, gathering evidence that would eventually be used to prosecute and imprison well over 100 of its members and associates. That the man responsible for bringing this agent into fold, vouching for him, mentoring him, extending him levels of trust and access that made the eventual damage possible, had been genuinely, thoroughly deceived rather than knowingly complicit, did not, within this internal logic, meaningfully mitigate the outcome. The family had been embarrassed on a scale that reverberated through every one of the other 5 families, all of whom would now, inevitably, view the Bonanno organization's internal security with heightened suspicion for years to come. Someone had to answer for that embarrassment, and the person who had to answer, according to the brutal calculus this world operated by, was a man whose sponsorship had made the breach possible in the first place, regardless of how genuinely, how completely, how understandably he had been fooled. This is worth sitting with, because it represents one of the more genuinely tragic ironies embedded in this entire story. Dominic Napolitano had spent his life enforcing, upholding, and internalizing precisely this code, a code that measured outcomes rather than intentions, that demanded accountability regardless of mitigating circumstances, that treated any failure capable of damaging the organization's security as functionally equivalent to disloyalty. He had lived by this code for decades. He had, in all likelihood, applied this exact same unforgiving standard to other men over the course of his career, ordering or sanctioning violence against associates whose failures, however unintentional, had put the organization at risk. And now that same code, a code he had helped enforce his entire adult life, was turning its full, unforgiving weight against him. There is no evidence in the historical record that Napolitano protested this logic or attempted to argue that his good faith deception should exempt him from its consequences. Whatever internal turmoil he may have experienced in the weeks following the FBI's revelation, he appears to have understood immediately and completely exactly what was coming, because he understood, better than almost anyone, exactly how the system he had spent his life inside actually worked. Almost immediately following the revelation, the isolation began. This is a pattern that recurs across countless accounts of Mafia justice during this era, and Napolitano's case followed it with grim, predictable precision, rather than immediate dramatic confrontation. The family's response took the form of slow, deliberate withdrawal. Men who had once gathered around him at the motion lounge, men who had answered to him as their captain, men who owed their livelihoods and their standing to his patronage, began quietly distancing themselves. Conversations grew shorter. Invitations dried up. The subtle social architecture of respect and inclusion that had surrounded Napolitano for years, the visible currency of his authority within the organization, began, almost imperceptibly at first, to erode. This isolation was not accidental or simply a product of individual men independently deciding to keep their distance out of caution. It reflected, according to later testimony from cooperating witnesses, including underboss turned informant Salvatore Sammy Gravano, and eventually Massino himself, a private, deliberate decision made at the leadership level of the family, that Napolitano would ultimately have to be killed. Massino, Napolitano's close friend of many years, the man whose rise to the ranks had run in near-perfect parallel to Napolitano's own, the man who had fought alongside him in the internal Bonanno War just months earlier during the Three Capos murder, would, according to later accounts and testimony, come to be understood as having concluded that the security breach was simply too catastrophic, too damaging to the families, standing among the other New York families, to be resolved through anything short of Napolitano's death. Massino's own later characterization of the reasoning, as reported by multiple accounts drawing on subsequent testimony, framed the killing in almost bureaucratic terms, that Napolitano owed the family, in effect, a receipt for the Donnie Brasco situation, a debt that could only be settled in blood, regardless of the genuine friendship that had once existed between the two men. This detail deserves particular emphasis, because it underscores just how completely institutional logic could override even the deepest personal bonds inside this world. Joseph Massino was not a distant, indifferent figure in Napolitano's life. He was by every account a close and long-standing friend, a man who had known Napolitano for years, who had built his own rise to the Bonanno hierarchy in close parallel with him, who had stood alongside him during one of the bloodiest nights in the family's recent history. And yet, when institutional necessity demanded it, that friendship did not prevent Massino from ultimately being complicit in, or, according to some accounts, directly authorizing the decision that would end Napolitano's life. It is difficult to imagine a starker illustration of the world Sonny Black had spent his entire adult life inside, a world where even the deepest personal loyalties existed permanently subordinate to institutional necessity, where friendship offered no meaningful protection once the organization's collective judgment turned against you. Through the remainder of July and into August 1981, Napolitano lived inside this tightening circle of isolation, not formally accused, not confronted directly with a verdict that had apparently already been quietly reached about his fate, but surrounded by the unmistakable, accumulating signals of a man who, standing inside his own world, was collapsing in real time. He continued, by all accounts, to move through his normal routines, the motion lounge, his rooftop pigeons, the daily rhythms of the life he had built across 5 decades in the same Brooklyn neighborhood. But the historical record, and Pistone's own later reflections on what he came to understand about this period, suggest strongly that Napolitano knew, well before any formal summons arrived, exactly what fate awaited him. A man who had spent his entire career reading the subtle signals of respect, suspicion, and institutional judgment inside this closed, highly attuned social world was more than capable of reading those same signals when they were, for the first time in his career, directed against him. There is a particular, almost unbearable poignancy to this period of Napolitano's life that deserves acknowledgement before we move to its conclusion. Because it wasn't simply the case that Sonny Black was facing institutional condemnation from a system he understood intellectually, according to an account Pistone would later share, drawn from a conversation he had years afterward with Napolitano's girlfriend, a woman identified as Judy. Sonny Black's emotional response to the entire situation, even in these final weeks of his life, was notably absent of anger or bitterness directed at the man who had, however unwittingly on Napolitano's part, brought this catastrophe down upon him. According to what Judy reportedly told Pistone, Napolitano had said, in the days before his death, that he felt no genuine ill will toward the man he'd known as Donnie Brasco, that if he had to be brought down by anyone, he was almost glad, in some complicated way, that it had been Pistone specifically. We will return to this detail and to its full emotional weight later in this story, but it's worth flagging here, because it reveals something essential about the character of the man facing his own institutional death sentence during these final weeks of July and August 1981. Whatever fear, whatever private turmoil Napolitano may have carried through this period, he does not appear to have allowed it to curdle into resentment toward the specific individual whose deception had triggered his downfall. This is, in its own way, a remarkable act of psychological and even moral clarity, a man capable of separating the operation itself, the machinery of federal law enforcement that had targeted his world, from the genuine human relationship he had built, however asymmetrically, with a specific agent who had executed that operation against him. It suggests, at minimum, that whatever else Sonny Black Napolitano was, a captain, an enforcer, a participant in serious violence across his career, he retained, right up to the edge of his own death, a capacity for something like grace. But grace, in the world Napolitano inhabited, offered no protection from institutional consequence. By mid-August 1981, the decision that had apparently already been reached quietly at the leadership level of the family was ready to be executed. August 17, 1981. We return now to where this story began, the Hamilton House restaurant in Brooklyn. The meal Sonny Black Napolitano ate, without any visible urgency, the jewelry and apartment keys he handed to his favorite bartender at the Motion Lounge, the quiet instruction about the pigeons on the roof. This time, we walked through it in full. Napolitano was, according to the most detailed accounts of that night, drawn primarily from Selwyn Raab's exhaustive history of New York's 5 families and corroborated across multiple subsequent retellings, picked up at the Hamilton House and told that a meeting was to take place. This was standard Mafia protocol for exactly this kind of situation. A man marked for death was rarely told directly, in explicit terms, that he was being summoned to his own execution. He was told he was going to a meeting, using language and procedure indistinguishable from the hundreds of other meetings he had attended across his career, precisely so that he would not resist, would not flee, would not force a public confrontation that might expose the organization's internal business to unnecessary risk or complication. Napolitano understood, regardless of the euphemistic framing, exactly what this particular summons meant. According to account of his final hours, before departing from the meeting, he told someone directly, in words that have survived, in close paraphrase, across multiple retellings of the story, that he was going to a meeting and that he did not know that he was coming back. This is worth pausing on. A man in Napolitano's position, with his decades of experience reading the internal signals of his world, with his intimate understanding of exactly how these situations typically resolve, chose in his final hours not denial, not panic, not flight, but a kind of clear-eyed, almost businesslike acceptance. He put his affairs in order with the same discipline he had brought to every other aspect of his life inside this world. The jewelry, handed over piece by piece to a bartender he trusted. The apartment keys, transferred with explicit instructions about the pigeons, animals he had bred, raced, and genuinely cared for across years, and whose welfare, even in his final hours, he clearly did not want left to chance or neglect. There is something almost unbearably human in this detail. A man facing his own imminent death choosing, among his very last act of agency, to make sure someone will remember to feed his birds. From a Hamilton house, Napolitano was driven by Bonanno associate Frank Lino, the same Frank Lino who had, remarkably, survived the ambush at the 2020 club just months earlier by escaping through an unlocked door while Giacone, Trinchera, and Indelicato were killed, and who was now, in one of the story's darker ironies, driving the very man who had helped orchestrate that earlier bloodshed toward his own death. Accompanying Lino, according to account of the evening, was another Bonanno associate, Stephen Cannoni. The destination was a private home belonging to Bonanno associate Ron Filicomo, in the Flatland section of Brooklyn. Some accounts place the specific location closer to the Eltingville area of Staten Island, a discrepancy that likely reflects the imprecision of second-hand reporting on an event whose full details were only pieced together years later through investigation and testimony. But the essential geography and character of the location remain consistent across every account. A quiet, unremarkable residential home, chosen precisely because it offered privacy and the appearance of an ordinary, low-key gathering rather than anything that would draw attention. Napolitano was led inside and told that the meeting would take place in the basement. Again, standard, unremarkable procedure, the kind of arrangement that would not have raised any outward alarm even from a man who almost certainly understood, on some level, exactly what awaited him at the bottom of those stairs. As he was led down toward the basement, Napolitano was pushed down the staircase, a waiting gunman. Accounts identify Filicomo and Lino as the men who ultimately carried out the shooting, using .38 caliber revolvers, attempted to fire. The first shot misfired. The gun jammed on the initial attempt. What happened next has become, across every serious retelling of this story, the single most haunting and widely repeated detail associated with Sonny Black Napolitano's death. Sprawled on his knees at the bottom of the staircase, having just survived a failed attempt on his life by a matter of seconds, Napolitano reportedly said to his killers, "Hit me one more time and make it good." It is worth being careful and precise here, in keeping with the historical record's own limitations. This quote comes to us secondhand, relayed through Pistone's own later writing, and corroborated across multiple independent retellings drawn from underworld accounts and subsequent reporting, rather than from any surviving direct witness testimony delivered under oath. It should be understood, As with any reported final words in circumstances like these, as a widely repeated account rather than a verified transcript, but its persistence across so many independent retellings, and its consistency with everything else we know about the man, his discipline, his composure, his refusal across the preceding weeks to display panic or protest in the face of his own institutional death sentence, lends a particular kind of authenticity, whether or not the exact words were spoken precisely as reported, whether literally accurate down to the syllable or not. The detail captures something essential and consistent about how Dominic Napolitano appears to have met the end of his life, not begging, not pleading, but demanding, even in his final moments, that the men killing him do the job properly rather than prolong the ordeal through incompetence. He was shot and killed. And then, according to Pistone's own later account, something additional was done to his body. His hands were severed. This detail, grim as it is, carried specific symbolic weight within the internal language of Mafia violence, a punishment understood, within that world's own grim iconography, as a message about the violation of organizational security. Hands that had, in the eyes of the men who killed him, extended trust and welcome to the wrong man, now removed as a form of symbolic, permanent condemnation. His face, according to later accounts, was so severely disfigured in the course of the killing that when his remains were eventually discovered, identification could only be confirmed through dental records. That discovery did not come quickly. Sonny Black Napolitano's body remained missing for nearly a full year following his death, his fate unconfirmed even as those close to him, and eventually federal investigators tracking the broader Bonanno case understood with near certainty what had happened to him. It was not until August 1982, almost exactly 1 year after his murder, that his remains were finally found in a marsh area near Arlington, Staten Island. Discovered inside what has been described as a hospital bag, the specific, grim detail of decomposition and discovery that closed out, at last, the year-long uncertainty surrounding his disappearance. He was 51 years old. The killing of Dominic Napolitano closed one chapter of this story, but it was, in a much larger sense, only the beginning of the reckoning that Joseph Pistone 6 years undercover had set in motion, a reckoning that would ultimately reshape not just the Bonanno crime family, but the internal operating procedures of organized crime across the country for decades to come. But before we trace that wider legacy, there's one piece of unfinished business inside Napolitano's own story that deserves its full weight. What happened to a man whose mentorship had first opened the door for Donnie Brasco inside the Bonanno family, Benjamin Lefty Guns Ruggiero, an extraordinary, almost unbearable position the FBI's operation placed him in, a position that in many ways mirrors and complicates everything we've just walked through regarding Napolitano. Ruggiero, like Napolitano, had spent years genuinely mentoring the man he knew as Donnie Brasco, teaching him practical mechanics and unwritten codes of life inside the Bonanno family, extending him the kind of sustained personal trust that made the entire operation possible in the first place. And Ruggiero, like Napolitano, faced exactly the same brutal institutional logic once the truth of Brasco's identity became known. Regardless of the genuineness of his deception, regardless of his own long, violent career of demonstrated loyalty to the organization, he had vouched for and cultivated a federal agent inside the family's ranks, and that failure carried consequences that the organization's internal code did not meaningfully mitigate based on intent. According to account of the period, Ruggiero, like Napolitano, was almost certainly marked for death by his own organization in the aftermath of the revelation. But Ruggiero's fate diverged from Napolitano's in one critical, decisive respect. The FBI moved to arrest him before the Bonanno family had the opportunity to carry out whatever violent reckoning it had planned for him. This is worth underscoring as one of the stranger, more morally complicated aspects of the entire operation's conclusion. In Ruggiero's case, federal prosecution, normally understood as a form of punishment and consequence, effectively functioned as a form of protection, removing him from the reach of an organization that would very likely have killed him had he remained accessible on the street. Ruggiero was ultimately convicted on racketeering conspiracy charges connected to the broader Donnie Brasco investigation and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, though his actual time served was reduced due to deteriorating health. He was eventually released early as his physical condition worsened. Throughout much of his incarceration, according to multiple accounts, including a recorded phone conversation captured before his arrest, Ruggiero maintained a stubborn, almost touching conviction that the man he'd known as Donnie Brasco could not possibly have betrayed him, telling his own lawyer, prior to full revelation settling in, that Brasco would never go against him. Once the truth became undeniable, once Pistone had testified against him directly in court, that conviction curdled into open, bitter fury. Ruggiero was reported to have vowed, in the aftermath of his conviction, that he would get his revenge on Pistone if it was the last thing he did. He never had the opportunity. Benjamin Ruggiero died of cancer in November 1994, having never carried out that threat, and, notably, in contrast to numerous other convicted mob figures of his era, having never agreed to formally cooperate with federal prosecutors himself, despite reported inquiries into whether he might be willing to flip. When a prosecutor once asked Pistone directly whether Ruggiero might ever be open to becoming a cooperating witness, Pistone's response, according to later retellings, was blunt. He told the prosecutor not to bother asking. There is something worth reflecting on in the contrasting fates of these two men who had, each in his own way, mentored and trusted Donnie Brasco across the same 6-year operation. Napolitano, the more senior, more established captain, the man who had gone so far as to move toward formally sponsoring Brasco's induction into the family, extending him the single highest level of institutional trust available inside that world, was killed by his own organization before the FBI's protective reach could extend to him. Ruggiero, arrested in time, survived to serve his sentence and eventually die of natural causes years later, outside the reach of the retribution that had almost certainly awaited him as well. The difference between these two outcomes appears to have come down, in large part, simply to timing, to which man the federal government's protective net managed to reach first, and which man remained exposed, in the open, long enough for his own family's justice to catch up with him. The broader scope of what the 6-year Donnie Brasco operation ultimately produced, once its full scale became clear through the resulting prosecutions, was staggering by the standards of any organized crime investigation before or since. Pistone's testimony and the evidence gathered across the operation's duration eventually contributed to over 100 convictions and more than 200 indictments across the Bonanno crime family and its associated networks, a scale of legal and institutional damage that effectively gutted the Bonanno organizations standing among New York's 5 families for years, in some accounts for more than a decade, reducing what had once been one of the city's 5 dominant crime organizations to a diminished, weakened, and internally distrustful shadow of its former self. The Pizza Connection case, a related and enormously significant federal prosecution targeting an international heroin trafficking network that used pizzerias as fronts for distribution across the United States, drew directly on intelligence and relationships developed during Pistone's undercover years, extending the operation's impact well beyond the Bonanno family's own internal structure and into one of the largest drug trafficking prosecutions in American history up to that point. The lasting institutional impact of the case reached even further than the specific prosecutions it generated. In the years and decades that followed, organized crime families across the country, not just a Bonanno organization, but the broader landscape of American Cosa and Nostra, fundamentally revised their internal security practices in direct response to the lessons of the Donnie Brasco operation. Induction procedures were tightened considerably, with family becoming far more rigorous and suspicious in vetting potential new members, extending the already lengthy traditional apprenticeship period even further in many cases. A pervasive new culture of paranoia took hold across organized crime circles, with members becoming markedly more cautious about extending the kind of deep, sustained personal trust that had made Pistone's operation possible in the first place. New and formal rules emerge around basic operational security, including, notably, an increased reluctance across Mafia circles to use full names allowed in conversation, even among trusted associates, precisely because the granular specificity of names, addresses, and identifying details had proven to be exactly the kind of intelligence an undercover operation could exploit most effectively. In a very real sense, Joseph Pistone's 6 years inside the Bonanno family didn't just result in prosecutions. It permanently altered the operational culture of organized crime in America, forcing an institution that survived for the better part of a century through careful adaptation to fundamentally rethink how it protected itself from exactly the kind of infiltration that had, for 6 years, operated undetected at its very heart. For Joseph Pistone himself, the conclusion of the operation in 1981 marked not an ending, but the beginning of an entirely new kind of existence, One lived permanently under the shadow of the very organization he had spent 6 years dismantling from the inside. The Bonanno crime family placed an open contract on his life, reportedly valued at as much as $500,000, a bounty that, in the eyes of the Mafia, represented both a genuine desire for retribution and a necessary statement of institutional resolve, a signal to every other family that betrayal, even unintentional betrayal on the part of those deceived, would not go unanswered where the actual traitor could still be reached. Pistone and his family were relocated repeatedly in the years that followed, by his own account, 5 or 6 separate times, living under assumed identities. His neighbors never knowing the man living among them had once spent 6 years embedded inside 2 of New York's most dangerous crime families. Decades later, well into his 80s, Pistone would confirm publicly that the danger, while diminished by the passage of time, had never entirely disappeared, that organizations like the one he'd infiltrated tend, in his own words, to have long memories, and that he continued taking precautions around how he traveled and who he met, well into the 21st century. Pistone did not simply retire quietly into the witness protection apparatus his testimony had helped make necessary for others. He continued serving as an FBI agent for several years following the operation's conclusion, and in a detail that speaks to both his own resilience and his genuine commitment to the work. He actually left the Bureau at one point and later, in 1992, at the age of 53, formally requested reinstatement, an unusual request the FBI agreed to only on the condition that he complete its full, physically demanding 16-week training course at Quantico, Virginia, alongside Recruits 3. Decades as junior, he passed, was rehired, and continued serving until reaching the Bureau's mandatory retirement age of 57. In 1988, Pistone published his account of the operation, Donnie Brasco, My Undercover Life in the Mafia, co-written with Richard Woodley. The book became a New York Times bestseller, offering the public its first detailed, first-hand account of what it had actually meant to live for 6 years as a federal agent embedded inside the American Mafia. Because numerous Bonanno-related prosecutions remain ongoing or pending at the time of the book's publication, Pistone was constrained in how much detail he could include about certain events and individuals, a limitation he would later address directly in a subsequent book, Donnie Brasco, Unfinished Business, published in 2007, in which he revisited the operation with considerably more candor, filling in details about Tony Mira, Lefty Ruggiero, Sonny Black Napolitano, and the broader Bonanno crew that legal constraints had prevented him from sharing 2 decades earlier. The scale of what Pistone's operation ultimately contributed to federal law enforcement's understanding of organized crime is difficult to overstate. Beyond the direct convictions his testimony helped secure, Pistone himself would later reflect that the deeper, longer-lasting value of the operation lay less in any single criminal case and more in the sheer volume of institutional intelligence it generated. A detailed, granular map of Mafia leadership, family structures, internal relationships, and operating procedures that would go on to inform virtually every major organized crime prosecution that followed for years afterward, cited repeatedly in affidavits and investigations well beyond the immediate scope of the Bonanno family case itself. The film adaptation of Pistone's story, released in 1997 under the simple title Donnie Brasco, starred Johnny Depp as Pistone and Al Pacino as Lefty Ruggiero, with Sonny Black Napolitano portrayed by Michael Madsen. The film would go on to be widely regarded as one of the finer entries in the American crime genre, frequently mentioned in the same breath as genre landmarks like Goodfellas and The Godfather. A remarkable cultural afterlife for a story that began as a classified federal investigation into truck hijacking rings. Pistone himself, speaking decades after the film's release, would characterize its overall accuracy as roughly 85% faithful to the real events, a notably high figure by the standards of Hollywood's typical relationship with true events, and one that speaks to how carefully the filmmakers worked to preserve the actual texture and emotional substance of what happened, rather than simply using the outline of a true story as a springboard for invented dramatics. But the fullest, most consequential postscript to Sonny Black Napolitano's murder didn't emerge from a book or a film. It emerged, decades later, from the American legal system itself, and it delivers one of the more remarkable ironies in this entire story, one that connects directly back to the code that had condemned Napolitano in the first place. Following the chaos and internal bloodshed of the early 1980s, Joseph Massino, Napolitano's own close friend, and, according to later testimony and investigation, one of the men most directly responsible for the decision to have him killed, steadily consolidated power within the wounded, destabilized Bonanno organization. By 1991, following a further round of internal violence targeting anyone who could be connected, however tangentially, to the Donnie Brasco infiltration or to rival claims on leadership, Massino emerged as the undisputed boss of family. He governed with an intensity of caution that reflected, in almost every particular, the lessons the family had drawn from Napolitano's downfall. He forbade his own capos and soldiers from ever speaking his actual name aloud, closed down the kind of visible, semi-public social clubs that had once served as Mafia headquarters throughout New York, and insisted that family business be conducted in locations remote enough to be disguised as ordinary personal travel rather than organizational. Meetings. Through the 1990s, as the other New York families weathered a wave of prosecutions and cooperating witnesses, Massino became known, almost admiringly within underworld circles, as the Last Don, the only sitting boss among the 5 families who remained free rather than imprisoned. That reign ended on January 9, 2003, when Massino was arrested under a sweeping federal racketeering indictment, an indictment that explicitly included charges connected to the 1981 murder of Dominic Napolitano. Alongside him, his own brother-in-law and longtime underboss Salvatore, good-looking Sal. Vitali was indicted as well, and Vitali, facing his own mounting legal jeopardy and increasingly isolated within a family that had turned suspicious of him, made the decision to cooperate with federal prosecutors and testify against Massino directly, setting off a further cascade of defections within the organization, as other Bonanno members and associates, fearful of being implicated in decades of accumulated, unresolved violence, began seeking their own arrangements with prosecutors. On July 30th, 2004, Joseph Massino was convicted on all counts, including responsibility for 7 murders, among them the killing of the man who had once been among his closest friends in the organization, facing the very real possibility of the death penalty in connection with an additional, separate murder charge still pending against him. Massino did something that no sitting or former boss of a New York crime family had ever done before in the modern history of American organized crime. He requested a meeting with the presiding judge and agreed to cooperate fully with the government, becoming the first boss of one of New York's 5 families to formally turn state's evidence. It is difficult to fully capture the weight of this development without pausing on it directly, because it represents perhaps the single most striking piece of dramatic irony contained anywhere within this entire story. Dominic Sonny Black Napolitano was killed in 1981 for security breach that was not his fault, for having been deceived in good faith by a federal agent whose skill and patience exceeded anything the internal Mafia code had built in defenses against. He was killed specifically because the organization's leadership, very likely including Massino himself, judged that the breach was too severe, too damaging to the family's institutional standing, to be forgiven regardless of Napolitano's own innocence of any actual wrongdoing. He was killed, in effect, to preserve the code of silence, the code of loyalty, the code that held that the organization's security mattered more than any individual life, even the life of a man who had done nothing but be genuinely, understandably fooled. And 23 years later, the very man who presided over that decision, who had, by his own later account, viewed Napolitano's death as a debt the organization was owed, broke that same code far more completely, far more voluntarily, and far more consequentially than Napolitano ever had, sitting down with federal prosecutors and beginning the process of dismantling from the inside the very institution he had spent his life rising through and ultimately led. As part of his cooperation, Massino provided information that allowed the FBI to finally locate and recover the remains of Philip Giacone and Dominic Trinchera, Sonny Red and Delicato's fellow victims from the Three Capos murder, whose bodies had lain buried in the Lindenwood, Queens lot known as the Hole, for over 2 decades. Massino would go on to testify in subsequent federal trials, including against his own eventual successor as Bonanno boss, Vincent Vinny Gorgeous Basciano, becoming, in the process, not merely a cooperating witness, but, by the account of prosecutors at the time, the first Mafia chieftain in American history to testify directly against a former subordinate. There is no need to editorialize heavily on what this reveals about the code Sonny Black Napolitano died to uphold. The facts speak plainly enough on their own. A man was killed in 1981 because his organization judged that even an innocent, unintentional failure to detect deception was an unforgivable breach of institutional loyalty. And the very organization that handed down that judgment was itself, within a generation, dismantled from within by the voluntary cooperation of its own most senior leadership. Men who broke faith with the code far more deliberately and far more consequentially than Napolitano ever had, in service of nothing more noble than their own self-preservation. The broader, cumulative impact of the Donnie Brasco investigation on the Bonanno crime family's institutional standing was, independent of Massino's eventual cooperation decades later, already severe well before that final chapter played out. According to later accounts from cooperating Gambino under boss Salvatore, Sammy the Bull Gravano, the sheer scale of embarrassment generated by the revelation that a federal agent had operated undetected inside the Bonanno family for 6 years drove the leadership of New York's other crime families to take the extraordinary step of formally suspending the Bonanno organization from the commission, the informal governing body of Mafia bosses that coordinated major decisions and disputes across the 5 families. This was not a minor procedural slight. Exclusion from the commission meant the Bonanno family's voice and influence within the broader structure of organized crime in New York was effectively silenced for years, a direct, tangible institutional punishment stemming from the very infiltration that had cost Napolitano his life. A final, almost unbearably ironic footnote to a story about a man killed specifically to demonstrate that the organization would not tolerate exactly this kind of embarrassment, only to suffer that exact embarrassment anyway, on a scale his death did nothing to prevent. Quick pause before we bring this story to its close. If you made it this far, thank you, genuinely. This is the kind of story that rewards patience, and I appreciate you sticking with it. If this has been worth your time, hit like, make sure you're subscribed, and share it with someone who get pulled into this kind of story the way you probably have been. There's a detail in this story that deserves to be set apart from everything else, given its own space to breathe, because it carries more emotional weight than almost anything else in the historical record of the Sonny Black Napolitano case, and because it's a detail that transforms the story from a straightforward account of betrayal and institutional violence into something considerably more complicated and considerably more human. Years after Napolitano's death, Joseph Pistone was contacted by a woman named Judy, Napolitano's girlfriend during the final period of his life. According to what Pistone would later share, drawing on that conversation, Judy told him something about Sonny Black's final days that neither Pistone nor anyone following the story from the outside could have anticipated. That in the period before his death, fully aware of what awaited him, Napolitano had expressed no genuine anger or resentment toward the man he had known as Donnie Brasco. That, according to what Judy relayed, Sonny Black had said he felt no ill will toward Pistone specifically, and that if he had to be brought down by someone, by anyone, he was almost glad, in some complicated, difficult to fully articulate way, that it had been Pistone. It is worth being careful here, as with all reported final sentiments relayed second-hand years after the fact, about the precise limits of what can be verified. This account comes to us through Pistone's own retelling of a private conversation, it's self-reporting what Judy told him Napolitano had said in his final days, a chain of second-hand testimony that cannot be independently corroborated the way a courtroom transcript or a documented FBI report can be. But its consistency with everything else we know about the man, his composure in the face of the FBI's initial revelation, his methodical, unpanicked handling of his own final affairs, his apparent refusal across those final weeks to lash out or protest the institutional logic that was consuming him, lends a genuine, credible weight, whether or not the exact wording survived perfectly intact across the retelling. If true, even approximately, it reveals something remarkable about the character of a man this story has, up to this point, largely had to describe to the language of crime, violence, and institutional consequence. It suggests that whatever else Dominic Napolitano was, a captain who helped orchestrate a triple murder, an enforcer who spent 3 decades inside one of the most violent organizations in American history, he retained, even faced his own death at the hands of the very code he'd spent his life upholding, a genuine capacity to separate the operation from the individual, the deception from the man who carried it out. He appears to have understood, on some level, that Pistone had simply been extraordinarily good at his job, and that there was in Napolitano's own final accounting of things something almost like respect embedded in that understanding, rather than pure bitterness. Pistone himself, for his part, never pretended that the relationship had been anything other than what it actually was. A professional deception sustained across years, in service of federal investigation whose entire purpose was ultimately to dismantle the organization Napolitano had given his life to. But Pistone also never pretended that the human dimension of that relationship had been fake. In his own writing, he described Napolitano in terms that go well beyond the clinical language of a case file, describing him as someone who was a phony, who carried himself with genuine dignity within the logic of his own world, whom Pistone, for reasons he himself found difficult to fully articulate, simply liked. This is, in the end, the emotional architecture at the center of this entire story. Two men who built something real between them, a friendship, however asymmetric, however ultimately weaponized by the institutional forces surrounding them, and who both, in their own ways, seem to have understood exactly what that friendship was, what it would eventually cost, and who was going to pay that cost, without either of them ever fully surrendering the human bond that had grown between them across 6 years of shared proximity. Dominic Sonny Black Napolitano lived his entire life by a code that measured man's worth by his loyalty, his discretion, his willingness to absorb whatever the organization demanded of him without complaint. He rose through the ranks of one of New York's most storied crime families across 3 patient decades, earning a rank and a reputation few men in his world ever achieved. And in the end, the single act of loyalty and mentorship he extended most fully, most genuinely, to another human being, a young jewel thief he brought into his crew, taught, defended, and trusted more deeply than nearly anyone else in his adult life, turned out to be the one relationship the code he lived by could never forgive. He was not undone by greed. He was not undone by carelessness, or by breaking faith with his own organization, or by any of the conventional failures that end careers and lives inside that world. He was undone by extending fully and without reservation the exact quality his own philosophy told him to guard most carefully, trust, to precisely the one person in his world who had been sent there deliberately and patiently to earn it. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a story like this once all the facts have been laid out. Once the dates are established, the names accounted for, the verdicts rendered by history rather than by any Mafia commission. And in that quiet, what remains isn't really the violence. It's the shape of the relationship at the center of it, and what that relationship says about the peculiar, unresolvable nature of loyalty inside a world built entirely around performance and enforcement of loyalty. Consider, for a moment, what Sonny Black Napolitano actually was, stripped of mythology that true crime storytelling tends to layer over figures like him. He was not a mastermind. He was not a criminal genius in the way pop culture often imagines Mafia captains to be. He was, by the consistent testimony of nearly everyone who encountered him, friends, associates, and a federal agent who spent 6 years studying him at the closest possible range, a disciplined, watchful, fundamentally decent man by the standards of the violent world he'd chosen to inhabit. He carried his own suitcases. He raised pigeons with genuine care. He mentored younger men not out of obligation, but, it seems, out of something closer to real investment in their development. He built a reputation across 3 decades not through spectacle or brutality performed for an audience, but through the slow, unglamorous accumulation of trust. Trust extended to him by his superiors, and trust he, in turn, extended to the people beneath him. And it was precisely that capacity, his willingness to trust, to mentor, to genuinely invest in the people he brought into his orbit, that a patient, brilliant, and ultimately merciless federal operation identified as the single most exploitable feature of his character. Joseph Pistone did not succeed because Sonny Black Napolitano was foolish. He succeeded because Napolitano was, in the ways that actually mattered to any functioning human relationship, a good judge of character. And Donnie Brasco had been built, painstakingly, over months of preparation and years of sustained performance, to be exactly the kind of person a good judge of character would trust. This is the uncomfortable truth sitting at the heart of this entire story, and it's worth stating plainly rather than letting it dissolve into vague sentiment. The qualities that make a person capable of real friendship, openness, generosity, the willingness to extend the benefit of the doubt to someone who has earned it through sustained proximity and demonstrated reliability. are the same qualities that make deception possible. You cannot build a defense against being genuinely, humanly liked by someone whose entire profession depends on being genuinely, humanly likable. Sonny Black didn't fail some test of criminal shrewdness. He simply did what decent people do when someone spends years earning their trust in good faith. He trusted them. The tragedy, then, isn't really a tragedy of misplaced trust in the sense of foolishness. It's closer to a tragedy of structure, of two men caught inside institutions, one criminal and one governmental, both of which demanded absolute, unwavering loyalty from their members, and both of which were willing to sacrifice individual human relationships whenever institutional necessity required it. Pistone's loyalty to the FBI required him to systematically, patiently betray a man who had come to trust and rely on him. Napolitano's own organization's loyalty to its code required it to kill a man who had done nothing more than extend good faith to someone who had earned it. Both men, in their own ways, were instruments of institutions larger than themselves. Institutions that used a very real human bond between them as raw material, and that ultimately discarded that bond, and in Napolitano's case discarded the man himself the moment institutional logic demanded it. There's a version of this story that ends simply as a cautionary tale. Don't trust strangers. Verify everything. The mob got what it deserved for the violence it dealt out across the decades. That version isn't wrong, exactly. But it misses what actually makes Sonny Black Napolitano's story linger the way it does, more than 4 decades after his death. More than a quarter century after a film that introduced the story to a global audience. What makes it linger is the specific, irreducible humanity of the details that survive. A man dying his prematurely silver hair black, giving himself an entire nickname in the process, without ever imagining that detail would end up recited in documentaries and true crime retellings decades after his death. A man keeping pedigree racing pigeons on a Brooklyn rooftop, leaning against a railing some quiet mornings just to look out over the only neighborhood he'd ever called home. 2 men, one real, one performing a role that would eventually cost the other his life, watching cartoons together on a couch on an ordinary morning, before either of them had to become, for the rest of that day, exactly who their respective organizations needed them to be. And then at the very end, a man who understood with total clarity what was coming, who chose in his final hours not panic but quiet, deliberate order, giving away his jewelry, giving away his keys, making sure someone would remember to feed the birds. A man who, according to the account that survives him, met his own death with the same composure that had defined his entire career, correcting his own executioner's aim rather than begging for a reprieve he must have known was never coming. And a man who, in his very last days, according to what his girlfriend would later tell the agent who had deceived him, held no real anger toward the specific human being who had brought his world crashing down. Because on some level, he seems to have understood that Donnie Brasco had simply done, with extraordinary skill, exactly what Sonny Black himself had spent 30 years teaching younger men do inside his own world. Survive by becoming whatever the situation required you to become. That is the story of Dominic Sonny Black Napolitano. Not simply a mobster who made a fatal mistake, but a man who lived his entire adult life according to an unforgiving code of loyalty and discipline, and who was ultimately destroyed not by abandoning that code, but by extending its most generous, most human interpretation to exactly the one person clever enough, patient enough, and skilled enough to turn that generosity into his death sentence. Joseph Pistone went on to live the rest of his life under assumed names, in relocated homes, carrying for decades a knowledge of exactly what his success had cost the people who had trusted him. He built, by any measure, one of the most consequential careers in the history of American undercover law enforcement, a career that helped dismantle a criminal organization that had operated with relative impunity for the better part of a century, that put well over 100 men behind bars, and that fundamentally, permanently changed how organized crime in America understood and protected itself against exactly the kind of infiltration he had pioneered. And somewhere inside that legacy, inseparable from it, sits the specific memory of a Brooklyn captain with dyed black hair and a rooftop full of pigeons, a man Pistone would go on to describe, in his own words, decades later, as someone he simply liked, for reasons he admitted that were hard to fully explain. Maybe that's the only honest way to end a story like this one, not with a clean moral, not with a villain fully condemned or a hero fully celebrated, but with the plain, uncomfortable truth that some of the most consequential relationships in this story were also, somehow, some of the most genuine, and that the machinery of institutional loyalty on both sides of the law ground on regardless of what either man actually felt about the other when the pretense finally fell away. Sonny Black Napolitano spent his whole life believing that strength, discipline, and loyalty were the currency that kept a man alive in his world. In the end, it was precisely his loyalty, extended fully and without reservation, to exactly the wrong person that cost him everything. That's the story of Sonny Black Napolitano, the mobster who spent 6 years unknowingly training the man who would help bring his entire world down, and who walked toward his own death with more composure than most of us could manage on an ordinary Tuesday. One last time, drop where you're watching this from down in the comments, and tell me what time it is right where you are. It's a small thing, but it always puts into perspective just how far a story like this actually travels once it's out in the world. If this one moved you, do 3 things before you go. Hit like, so more people who'd appreciate a story like this actually get to see it. Subscribe, so you're here for the next deep dive into real, documented mob history, and send this to one person you know who'd get pulled in exactly the way you probably were. Because in the end, that's really what this story is about. Not guns, not blood, not basements in Brooklyn. It's about a man who spent his whole life learning exactly who to trust, and who never saw the one exception coming, right up until the moment he was on his knees, telling the men who'd been sent to kill him to make the next shot count.